He's okay, so he's allowed to stay there. You can bring him in, Loretta. Mr. Tomlinson, you may want to make room for them to go through there. Okay, we're all present. While the jury remains standing, everyone may be seated. I think they're swearing the jury at this time. Jurors, if you could raise your right hand, please. Do you swear affirm that you will arrive at a verdict according to the evidence in the law as contained in the instructions of the court? You may be seated. Folks, what we're going to do is I'm going to read you some instructions now. Just pay close attention to the instructions. It basically tells you what to expect and what your duties are as jurors. And then after that, we'll go into opening statements. Okay, once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Judge Eichwald. I'll be presiding over this trial. My bailiff, Loretta Martinez, she's over here. She'll be helping you throughout the trial. My administrative assistant, Georgia Madrid, she'll be in and out throughout the course of the trial. And Christine Roybal is our jury clerk. And without forgetting, Ms. Andrea Lynch is our court reporter, and she will, on occasion, tell witnesses to slow down, speak up louder, or whatever they need to do, because she's taking the entire record. And you must pay close attention to the testimony, even though there is a court reporter making a record of the trial, because ordinarily transcripts of witnesses will not be provided to you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a criminal case commenced by the state of New Mexico against the defendant, Dean Cummings. The defendant is charged with the following: second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and concealing identity. The defendant is presumed innocent. The state has a burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. What I will say now is an introduction to the trial in this case. As this trial begins, I have some instructions for you. These instructions, along with those previously given, are preliminary only and may be changed during or at the end of the trial. All of you must pay attention to the evidence. After you have heard all the evidence, I will read the final instructions of the law to you. You will also receive a written copy of all instructions. You must follow the final instructions in deciding the case. This trial is expected to go through the middle of next week. The usual hours of trial will be from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. However, every day before you leave, I'll let you know what time we start the next day. As I explained earlier, there'll be a couple of days where we have to either start late, leave early, and so forth. So I'll let you know the day before. It's kind of a different situation than pre-COVID, in that what would happen before is we'd have all the jurors assemble in the jury room, which is right there. When we all assemble, then we'd bring you out. I'll give you instructions as to how to report tomorrow morning. And usually what it is, I'll have you folks congregate in the hall. When all 14 are ready, then they'll bring you in. But I'll give you further instructions before you leave today. You're allowed but not required to take notes during trial. Note paper has been provided for this purpose, and they should be in those little jury bags. Notes should not take the place of your independent memory of the evidence. When taking notes, please remember the importance of paying close attention to the trial. Listening and watching witnesses during their testimony will help you assess their appearance, behavior, memory, and whatever else bears on their credibility. At each recess, you must either leave your notes on your chair or take them with you to the jury room. At the end of the day, the bailiff will store your notes and return them to you when the trial resumes. When deliberations commence, you will take your notes with you to the jury room. Ordinarily, at the end of the case, the notes will be collected and destroyed. A criminal trial generally begins with the lawyers telling you what they expect the evidence will show. These statements and other statements made by the lawyers during the course of the trial can be of a considerable assistance to you in understanding the evidence as it is presented at trial. Statements of the lawyers, however, are not themselves evidence. The evidence will be the testimony of witnesses, exhibits, and any stipulation or fact agreed to by the parties. After you have heard all the evidence, I will give you final instructions on the law. The lawyers will argue the case, and then you will retire to the jury room to arrive at a verdict. It is my duty to decide what evidence you may consider. Your job is to find and determine the facts in this case, which you must do solely upon the evidence received in court. It is the duty of a lawyer to object to questions, testimony, or exhibits the lawyer believes may not be proper, and you must not hold such objection against the objecting party. I will sustain objections if the question or evidence sought is improper for you to consider. If I sustain an objection to the evidence, you must not consider such evidence, nor may you consider any evidence I have told you to disregard. By itself, a question is not evidence. You must not speculate about what would be the answer to a question that I rule cannot be answered. It is for you to decide whether the witnesses know what they are talking about and whether they are being truthful. You may give the testimony of any witness whatever weight you believe it merits. You may take into account, among other things, the witness's ability and opportunity to observe, memory, manner, or any bias or prejudice that the witness may have, and the reasonableness of the testimony considered in light of all the evidence of the case. No ruling, gesture, or comment I make during the course of the trial should influence your decision in this case. At times, I may ask questions of witnesses. If I do, such questions do not in any way indicate my opinion about the facts or indicate the weight I feel you should give the testimony of the witness. Ordinarily, the attorneys will develop all pertinent evidence. It is the exception rather than the rule that an individual juror will have an unanswered question after all the evidence is presented. However, if you feel an important question has not been asked or answered, write the question and your name down on a piece of your notepaper and give it to the bailiff before the witness leaves the stand. I will decide whether or when your question will be asked. Rules of evidence or other considerations apply to questions you submit and may prevent the question from being asked. If the question is not asked, please do not give it further consideration. Do not discuss it with other jurors, and please do not hold it against either side that you did not get an answer. There are a number of important rules governing your conduct as jurors during the trial. You must decide the case solely upon the evidence received in court. You must not consider anything you may have read or heard about the case outside of the courtroom. During the trial and your deliberations, you must avoid news accounts of the trial, whether they be on radio, television, the internet, or in any newspaper or other written publication. You must not visit the scene of the incident on your own. You cannot make experiments with reference to the case. You as jurors must decide this case based solely on the evidence presented here within the four walls of this courtroom. This means that during the trial, you must not conduct any independent research about this case, the matters in this case, and the individuals or corporations involved in this case. In other words, you should not consult dictionaries or reference materials, search the internet, websites, blogs, or use any other electronic tool to obtain information about this case or to help you decide the case. You are prohibited from attempting to find out information from any source outside the confines of this courtroom. After the parties have made their closing arguments, you will retire to deliberate. Until you retire to deliberate, you may not discuss this case with anyone, even your fellow jurors. After you retire to deliberate, you may begin discussing the case with your fellow jurors, but you cannot discuss the case with anyone else, including your family and friends, until you have returned a verdict and the case is at an end. I know that I know that many of you use cell phones, the internet, and other tools of technology. You are not to discuss or provide any information to anyone about this case through telephone calls or text messaging. You are not to engage in any social media interaction, communication, or exchange of information about this case until I have accepted your verdict and this case is at an end. This rule applies to all chats, comments, direct messaging, instant messaging, posts, tweets, blogs, vlogs, or any other means of communicating, sharing, or exchanging information through social media. It is important that you keep an open mind and not decide any part of this case until the entire case has been completed and submitted to you. Your special responsibility as jurors demands that throughout the trial, you exercise your judgment impartially and without regard to sympathy, bias, or prejudice. Therefore, until you retire to deliberate, you must not discuss this case or the evidence with anyone, even with each other, because you have not heard all the evidence, you have not been instructed on the law, and you have not heard the final arguments of the lawyers. If an exhibit is admitted in evidence, you should examine it yourself and not talk about it with other jurors until you retire to deliberate. To minimize the risk of accidentally overhearing something that is not evidence in this case, please continue to wear juror badges while in and around the courthouse. If someone happens to discuss the case in your presence, report that fact at once to a member of the staff. Although it is natural to visit with people you meet, please do not talk with any of the attorneys, parties, witnesses, or spectators either in or out of the courtroom. If you meet in the hallways or elevators, there is nothing wrong with saying a good morning or a good afternoon, but your conversation should end there. If the attorneys, parties, and witnesses do not greet you outside of the court or avoid riding in the same elevator with you, they are not being rude. They are just carefully observing this rule. Witnesses other than the parties, representatives of the state, and expert witnesses will wait outside of the courtroom until they are called to testify. Witnesses may not talk to other witnesses while waiting to testify. The lawyers are responsible for monitoring their own witnesses to ensure that they do not enter into the courtroom. Cameras are allowed in the court of this state under certain guidelines. In order not to distract you, they will be located in a designated area of the courtroom. In the event that any member of the jury is distracted by any member of the news media, you should immediately advise this to the court. The news media has been instructed not to film this jury or any member of the jury, whether in the courtroom or outside of the courtroom. The cameras may be allowed to photograph the testimony of certain witnesses and not others, or only portions of testimony of some witnesses. You should not draw any inference or conclusions whatsoever from this fact. The prosecuting attorney may not make an opening statement. The defendant's attorney may make an opening statement or may wait until later in the trial to do so. What is said in opening statement is not evidence. The opening statement is simply the lawyer's opportunity to tell you what the lawyer expects the evidence will show. State, you may make your opening statement.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention this morning. I know it's a long morning, and now that you ate lunch, hopefully we won't put you to sleep. So thank you, though, for being honest in your answers so that we can pick the most fair and impartial jury for this trial. This is a criminal trial, as you heard, commenced against the state of New Mexico against Dean Cummings. And I'm going to play for you a phone call from a 911 operator to the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office dispatch that was made on February 29th of 2020. And hopefully I can. me see. I bet my audio's on. Nothing like electronics. Is it on the court thing?
Pardon me?
On the podium thing? Because I have it plugged in.
Is Jason here? Give me a second. We're getting it.
That's okay. I'll proceed without it. Your
Pardon me?
Honor. I'll proceed without it.
Okay, if you need it, IT is coming in, but you may continue.
There we go. Plugged in. And that's from the last trial. That's okay. I'll proceed without it.
Okay.
Thank you for your time and attention, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing like technology to put a bump in the road, right? Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard, or you can guess from Vodire, this case isn't about who did it or how it was done. This case, the facts for you to decide are whether or not this homicide was committed in self-defense or whether it was committed with or without sufficient provocation. A second-degree murder is a homicide that was committed without having been sufficiently provoked, whereas a voluntary manslaughter is a homicide committed after having been sufficiently provoked. And the judge is going to give you the definitions to all of these things and what that law means. This case, ladies and gentlemen, is a case about reasonableness. And you, ladies and gentlemen, are the finders of the facts. The state has the burden of proof of showing that Dean Cummings, the defendant in this case, committed this homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. And the state will also show that the defendant, Mr. Cummings, also committed the crime of tampering with evidence. And that is because he washed his face, his hands, and changed his clothing after committing that homicide. And the state will also show that he committed the crime of concealing identity, because when law enforcement came and interacted with him, he didn't give his identity to them. The evidence is going to show, ladies and gentlemen, that on
Ms. Walker,
February...
Ms. Walker, IT person is here if you want to.
That's okay. I'll just proceed. It's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is going to show that on February 29th of 2020, at Guillermo Arriola's ranch, which is way out past Cabazon Peak, in the far remote area of Sandoval County, New Mexico, a ranch that is so remote that there is no cell phone service out there. And a ranch that is so remote that law enforcement had to use GPS coordinates on the search warrants. The evidence is going to show that the defendant killed Guillermo Arriola in his trailer. And the evidence will show that Mr. Arriola had been contemplating selling this ranch to Dean Cummings. He had his realtor, Christine Landers, draft up a real estate contract to sell this property to Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings had time to contemplate the purchase of this property and had not yet signed the real estate contract at the time of the homicide. On February 29th, 2020, Guillermo Arriola drove out to his ranch out in Sandoval County to meet with Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings shot and killed Mr. Arriola with a Sig Sauer AR-15 rifle. This rifle had a 30-round magazine and a scope on it. Mr. Arriola was 47 years old at the time of his death, and he was shot 2 times that day. He was shot once in the head and once in the chest. Law enforcement came and processed the scene, and they recovered 10 casings, spent casings, from that bedroom where he was shot. In Mr. Arriola's right hand was a can of mace, and that can of mace was facing Mr. Arriola, not outwards towards any attacker, but facing him and his body. You will be asked to determine whether the reasonableness of Mr. Cummings' actions when he committed this homicide. Were his actions reasonable when he shot and killed Mr. Arriola with an AR-15? Initially, when law enforcement went, Mr. Cummings refused to identify himself when the deputies made contact with him. And Mr. Cummings told the Sandoval County Sheriff's deputies that he killed Mr. Arriola in self-defense because he was sprayed with a neurological agent, presumably the mace. Mr. Cummings told deputies that he washed himself off to get rid of the neurological agent and that he changed his clothing. Now let's talk about the evidence that's going to be presented to you over the next week and a half. You're going to hear testimony from Christine Landers. Ms. Landers is going to tell you that she drafted that real estate contract for Mr. Arriola to sell the land to Mr. Cummings. She's going to tell you that she met Mr. Cummings and Mr. Arriola about a month before the homicide to go over this real estate contract. She's going to tell you that Mr. Cummings had his fifth wheel parked on the ranch property. And you're also going to hear testimony from David McCullough. Mr. McCullough will tell you that on February 29th, 2020, which was a leap day, he was out riding his ATV out in the middle of the desert at Cabazon Peak, and he came upon Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings spoke with him and conversed with him for about an hour, and then Mr. Cummings asked him to come with him to witness the body. Mr. Cummings told Mr. McCullough that he killed a man in self-defense and he wanted him to witness the body. Mr. McCullough followed Mr. Cummings back to the ranch, and Mr. McCullough will tell you that he had medical training, so he believed he could render aid to anybody who was injured. So that's why he went back to the trailer, to the ranch, to see if he could render aid. Mr. McCullough will tell you that Mr. Arriola was past the point of aid being rendered. The defendant, Dean Cummings, told Mr. McCullough that he had used the rifle in the back of his truck to kill Mr. Arriola. Mr. McCullough will tell you that he saw the rifle in the back of Mr. Cummings' truck, and then he proceeded to drive to an area where he could get cell phone service. Mr. Cummings stayed back at the ranch while Mr. McCullough drove out to get cell phone service. The area was so remote that it took him several times to get in touch with a 911 dispatch. And you'll hear those calls, and they continue to be dropped. He made about 4 calls to 911. You'll hear those calls. Mr. McCullough waited for law enforcement, and then he led them to the remote area where the ranch was located. After Mr. McCullough called law enforcement, then Mr. Cummings also called law enforcement. You're going to hear testimony from several Sandoval County Sheriff's deputies. You're going to hear testimony from Deputy Hayden Walker. He was one of the initial responding officers that responded on February 29th, 2020. You'll hear that he met Mr. McCullough, and Mr. McCullough led him into the ranch. And you'll hear that Mr. Cummings told him he killed Mr. Arriola in self-defense because he was sprayed with a neurological agent. Deputy Walker placed Mr. Cummings in the back of his patrol car while they conducted the investigation. And Mr. Cummings tells the deputies that he placed the rifle on the porch and that he had the magazine, he took the magazine out, and they were both laying on the porch for them. Mr. Cummings tells Deputy Walker that he washed his face off and his hands and changed his clothing. You'll also hear testimony from Deputy Jonathan Crispin, and he also responded to the scene with Deputy Walker. They secured the scene. They made contact with Mr. McCullough. He collected some witness statements while he was there on scene. And then they secured the perimeter. They went into the trailer to make sure that there was nobody else that was injured. And then they held the scene until the remainder of law enforcement can come. You're going to hear testimony from Sergeant Thomas Griffin, another officer with the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office. And he was the on-scene sergeant out there at the ranch. He arrived with Deputy Gutierrez, and he was present when Mr. Cummings was evaluated by Emergency Medical Services. Mr. Cummings told Sergeant Griffin that the clothing he was wearing at the time of the homicide was in the back of his truck. So Deputy Griffin collects those clothing, and he's going to tell you that the clothing was indeed wet, as if Mr. Cummings had washed himself off. Sergeant Griffin also assisted with the towing of the vehicles from that ranch. They towed the vehicle of Guillermo Arriola. They towed the vehicle of Mr. Cummings, his truck, as well as the fifth wheel. Sergeant Griffin also collected the evidence. So in this homicide, the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office called the New Mexico State Police, and they come out and they assist with the crime scene. So he collected the evidence from the New Mexico State Police that was collected from the scene that day, and he's the one who tags it into evidence. You'll also hear testimony from Lieutenant Frank Tomlinson, our case agent here. He was assigned this investigation, and he's the one who was in charge of making sure everything got done. Lieutenant Tomlinson assisted with the investigation while working out of the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office, which is right here in the courthouse, while Thomas Griffin was the one at the ranch. Because there was no cell phone service, they had to play telephone tag, if you will, to get sure the warrant's done. He wrote several warrants, and he interviewed several witnesses, and you're going to hear about all of that part of the investigation. He also transported the evidence. As I stated, the New Mexico State Police assisted with this investigation by processing the scene. And you're going to hear testimony from Carlos Herrera, the New Mexico State Police case agent. He was the criminalistics agent. So he was the one in charge of making sure all of the evidence is documented and collected. New Mexico State Police arrived at the ranch after the warrants were granted so that they collect and document everything. He'll tell you about the processing of the scene. One person is assigned to take photographs. One person is assigned to scan the scene. And he was assigned with documenting the casings, the trajectory, where the blood was, and things like that. Agent Herrera is going to tell you that he collected 10 spent casings from the scene that day. He collected the mace, and he collected the AR-15 rifle. Agent Bogue, also to the New Mexico State Police in the criminalistics portion, she was assigned with running what's called a Leica scanner, and it's a scanner that scans the whole room, and she uses the information from that scan to create a diagram. And she'll testify about the diagram that she created that documents where the body is, where the casings were, and the outline of the house. And you're finally going to hear from Jennifer Otto. She is the New Mexico Department of Public Safety DNA analyst. She's going to testify about the analysis of the evidence that was sent to her for review and whose DNA was on what and what kind of DNA it was. And finally, you'll hear from Dr. Heather Gerald of the Office of Medical Investigator. She is the chief medical investigator there at UNM, and she conducted the autopsy of Guillermo Arriola. She's going to testify that Mr. Arriola had 2 gunshot wounds to his body. The first gunshot wound was to the head, and it entered at the right temple with a trajectory of right to left and downward. Dr. Gerald will testify that there was a second gunshot wound of the chest, and it entered at the supraclavicle region of the chest and exited the left side of the chest. As I stated, ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of reasonableness. A second-degree murder is a homicide committed without having been provoked, and a voluntary manslaughter is a homicide committed after having been sufficiently provoked. And the judge is going to give you the definition of what sufficient provocation is. Again, this case isn't about who did it or how it was done. The facts for you, ladies and gentlemen, are to decide whether this homicide was committed in self-defense or whether it was committed with or without sufficient provocation. This is a case of reasonableness, and you are the finders of fact. You are going to determine whether or not Mr. Cummings' actions were reasonable on that day when he shot and killed Mr. Arriola with an AR-15 rifle when he only had mace. And I surmise to you that the evidence will show that there was no struggle in the bedroom, that little bedroom on February 29th, 2020, and the evidence will show that this was not a justified homicide. Mr. Arriola cannot speak about what happened in that little room on that day, but the evidence will show what happened on that day. And at the end of the case, the state, we're going to ask you to find Mr. Cummings guilty of second-degree murder or the lesser included offense of voluntary manslaughter for the killing of Guillermo Arriola. And we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of tampering with evidence for him washing his hands, his face, and changing his clothes after the homicide, And we will ask you to find him guilty of concealing his identity when he refused to identify himself to the law enforcement officers on that day. And thank you for your time.
Ms. Moss.
Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon. This case is not about who did it. Ms. Walker is correct, because Guillermo Arriola was shot and killed by Dean Cummings. There's no dispute in that. So the question before the court, before the jury, isn't who killed him, but why. And the evidence is going to explain to you why that happened. The facts that led up to the death of Mr. Arriola. Mr. Cummings told the police when he called 911 that day. He called them and he told them, "My name is Dean Cummings. I just shot and killed a man in self-defense." So he told the police that right away. And he told David McCullough that right away. Because after this shooting happened, Mr. Cummings reacted. He was in the middle of nowhere. And you're going to hear evidence, and Ms. Walker showed you some overhead photos of where this occurred, the ranch where this occurred. It was out in the middle of nowhere. It's a remote area. There is no cell phone service out there, not for miles. It's a place that is so remote, there are no neighbors, there's no other buildings. You have to drive for miles before you reach anyone or anything. And that's where Mr. Cummings found himself on February 29th, 2020. Because as you heard from Ms. Walker, and you will hear in the evidence, Mr. Cummings was looking to purchase some land. He grew up in New Mexico, Los Alamos to be specific. He grew up here. He spent his childhood in New Mexico before leaving for Colorado and then Alaska. And then in 2019, he returned to New Mexico. Mr. Cummings is an outdoorsman. He's a man who loves to be out in the wilderness, to be out in remote areas, to live off the land. And so he was looking for a piece of land back home here in New Mexico where he could build a home, start a new life. And Mr. Arriola owned property that was what he was looking for. This property out there, out near San Luis, San Isidro area, near Cabazon Peak. Remote, beautiful land. So Mr. Cummings and Mr. Arriola were planning this real estate transaction. And Mr. Cummings was excited about his future. And you're going to hear evidence about this real estate contract that they were negotiating. And Mr. Cummings had every intention of buying that land. And in the meantime, he was permitted to stay out there. He put his RV out there, and he was allowed to stay in this little trailer. Mr. Arriola encouraged him to stay out there, encouraged him to get to know the land, the property, the trailer. There were some horses out there. Mr. Cummings was helping take care of the horses, feeding them. And that's what led up to this incident on February 29th. Mr. Cummings was staying there, as he had been told and encouraged to do, when Mr. Arriola showed up. He showed up unexpectedly. Mr. Cummings and Mr. Arriola started talking about this real estate contract, and they started arguing. It was a verbal argument in the kitchen of this small trailer. And while they were arguing, all of a sudden, Mr. Arriola attacked Mr. Cummings. Without any warning, Mr. Cummings was all of a sudden fighting for his life. Mr. Arriola and Mr. Cummings were in this physical altercation. It led down this very short hallway to a small bedroom. And it was during this physical altercation that Mr. Cummings realized that Mr. Arriola had something in his right hand. You're going to hear testimony Mr. Arriola was right-handed. You're going to hear testimony that Mr. Arriola routinely carried a canister of mace with him. Mr. Cummings didn't know exactly what it was, but all he knew was that he was being struck with this thing in Mr. Arriola's hand over and over again. During this altercation, Mr. Cummings was able to grab his rifle that he had had sitting there. He had recently purchased a scope and was putting the scope onto the rifle, which is why it was sitting there. He grabbed the rifle, and he and Mr. Arriola started fighting over this rifle. And it was during this struggle, Mr. Cummings has one hand on this rifle. He has his other hand blocking, his left hand blocking Mr. Arriola, who's repeatedly striking him. During this struggle between these two men, all of a sudden, Mr. Cummings realized that his eyes were starting to burn, his lungs were starting to burn. Something had been sprayed. He didn't know what this stuff was. But at the same time he starts to feel this burning sensation, he feels Mr. Arriola pulling on the rifle. They're fighting over control over this gun. Whoever wins is going to live. Whoever loses was going to die. And during the struggle over this gun, the cap on the scope of the rifle comes off. And that's important. And you're going to see the evidence. You're going to see photos of that cap. That cap had been taped onto the scope with electrical tape. Mr. Cummings had taped the cap on with electrical tape, so it was on there good. And you'll see photos, and you're going to see the evidence that shows that the cap from that scope ended up underneath Mr. Arriola's body because it came off during a physical fight for control of that gun. During this struggle for the gun, shots went off. You're going to see photos of bullet holes in the trailer. That is important because those bullet holes, or we call them impact sites, a lot of times that's what we refer to them as, those impact sites tell the story of what really happened in that trailer. And you're going to hear from an expert who's going to explain that to you. But some of those bullets sprayed down the hallway and out of the trailer. Three bullets went out the trailer on the other side of the trailer from where the small bedroom was. And that shows how this fight was progressing and continuing as these men are fighting each other for control of this gun. They end up in this small bedroom, and Mr. Cummings ends up basically trapped in that room. Mr. Arriola's in front of him. The only way for him to escape is through Mr. Arriola. And you're going to see other impact sites on the floor in that bedroom, and those impact sites are really important. And you're going to have an expert who's going to explain to you why those impact sites are so important. And the reason that those impact sites are so critical is because what they're going to show you is that at some point during that struggle, the gun that ultimately killed Mr. Arriola, that firearm was upside down, almost on the ground, when it went off. Again, the evidence will show that that gun was upside down, literally almost on the ground, when 2 shots were fired. That shows you that there was a physical fight, a struggle occurring over that firearm. You're going to see that firearm. It's going to be in this courtroom. You're going to have a chance to look at it. And it's important that you take a close look at that firearm. Technology.
There's a light. There you go.
There we go.
It'll get going.
Is there a way to zoom in?
Those lights.
There you go.
That come up in that one.
There you go.
There we go. This is a photo of that gun that was taken by an investigator with the Office of the Medical Investigator. What you're looking at there, this is the AR-15 that was involved in this struggle. What you see there is some kind of residue or spatter that dried on that firearm that is consistent with Mr. Cummings' story that something was sprayed at him that day during that struggle while they're fighting over that gun. You're going to be able to look at that firearm when it's in this courtroom. So those are the two important things about that firearm that the evidence is going to show. One, this residue or spatter that dried on the gun. And two, that the muzzle created those marks on the floor, showing that that gun was literally on the floor or almost on the floor when it went off at least twice. You're going to hear evidence from Dr. Gerald with the Office of the Medical Investigator, as Ms. Walker indicated. Officer Gerald conducted the autopsy of Mr. Arriola. And there's a couple of important details that she's going to tell you about what that autopsy revealed. First, the trajectory of those bullets. Mr. Arriola was shot and killed by 2 bullets. Both of those bullets entered in a right to left trajectory. One through his temple and downward, and ended up in his chest. The other one entered on the right side of his chest and went through and exited on the left side. So those 2 bullets, both right to left in a downward trajectory. Dr. Gerald will be testifying to that, and you'll probably see some photographs that also help to demonstrate some of that. The other thing that she's going to tell you is that Mr. Arriola was intoxicated at the time of this altercation. He was intoxicated on alcohol, he had cocaine in his system, and he had marijuana in his system. And Dr. Gerald will explain to you the significance of that combination of alcohol and cocaine when it's in someone's system at the same time. You're going to see photographs that detail the scene. And again, I explained, you're going to see photographs of those impact sites that tell you the story of what happened in that trailer. The impact sites that go down the hall out of the trailer, the other impact sites next to Mr. Arriola's body that show that the gun was on the floor when it went off. And you're going to also hear testimony from an expert by the name of Aaron Brudenell. Mr. Brudenell is a forensic scientist who has spent decades working with the Arizona Department of Public Safety. He is a forensic scientist. His full-time job is working for the prosecution in Arizona. He analyzes crime scenes, especially when there are firearms involved, and he reconstructs shootings. He took the evidence that was gathered by the New Mexico State Police and the Sandoval County Sheriff's Department. He took that evidence and he examined it, and he reconstructed what happened in that trailer that day. Mr. Brudenell is going to testify that he closely examined those impact sites that I've just briefly described for you, and he's going to tell you that the physical evidence that he saw is consistent with some kind of physical struggle occurring over that firearm. So at the end of this trial, there is not going to be a dispute about the fact that Mr. Cummings did shoot and kill Mr. Arriola. And the evidence is going to show that he acted in self-defense. The evidence is also going to show that he did not conceal his identity at any point in time. In fact, the evidence will show that he placed a 911 call to the police identifying himself and explaining what had just happened in that trailer. The state has also charged Mr. Cummings with tampering with evidence, and I'm just going to briefly address what the evidence is in that. The state is going to ask you to convict him of tampering with evidence because he washed his face, washed his hands, and removed his clothing after this incident occurred. However, what did Mr. Cummings do with that evidence? What did he do with his clothing? Well, the prosecution's own witnesses are going to testify that Mr. Cummings put his clothes on the back of his pickup truck. And the prosecution's own witnesses are going to tell you that when the police arrived on scene, he told them where his clothing was. He asked them to collect his clothing and test it for whatever he had just been sprayed with. So the evidence is going to show that Mr. Cummings acted in self-defense, that he did not tamper with evidence, and that he did not conceal his identity. That is what this evidence will show. Thank you.
The state will now present its evidence. After the state has presented its evidence, the defendant may present evidence, but is not required to do so because the burden is always on the state to prove defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. State, you may call your first witness.
Your Honor, the state will call Deputy Hayden Walker.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me just. Do you want it right there?
Are you going to address the witness? You're going to address the witness, right? Turn
Yes,
it
sir.
another 90 degrees.
There we go.
Deputy, before you take the stand, I'll need to swear you in. Raise your right hand, please.
Yeah, we're gonna.
Do you
no,
swear?
No, we won't need that. No, we won't need that. No.
Do you swear affirming the testimony you're about to give is the truth on the penalty of law?
I do.
Go and take a seat.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Could you please start by telling us and spelling your first and last name?
My first name is spelled Hayden. My last name is spelled Walker.
And where are you currently employed?
I'm working for a personal friend.
Okay. So are you working in law enforcement currently?
No, ma'am.
Were you previously employed by the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office?
Yes, ma'am.
How long total did you work for the Sandoval County Sheriff's Office?
Approximately 2 years.
And prior to that employment, had you been employed with any other law enforcement agency?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell us about that?
So in 2014, I started with the Lee County Sheriff's Department, and 2016, I worked with the Hobbs Police Department.
And so I guess I should just call you Mr. Walker, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Sounds funny. Can't call you deputy now, so. Mr. Walker, were you on duty February 29th of 2020?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell us what shift you were working?
I believe I was working swing shift.
And what hours are swing shift?
To my memory, it's from 2 p.m. to midnight.
Okay. And while you were on duty on February 29th of 2020, did you receive a call to go to the remote area near Cabazon Peak?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you describe the nature of the call that you received or the call out?
From my recollection, it involved a possible shooting. It was not confirmed, but the call came out as a shooting.
Now, when you, excuse me, when you were working, did you wear a uniform and a badge of office?
Yes, ma'am.
And what kind of vehicle did you drive?
A marked Dodge Ram pickup truck.
And did you drive alone, or did you have a partner with you?
I drove by myself.
Can you tell us approximately what time you got the call to go out to that area?
May I refresh my memory?
Would looking at your report help refresh your memory?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a copy of your report with you?
No, ma'am.
May I approach the witness? Yeah, can we Yes, okay, no,
You may respond.
approach right now. Apologize, I've got some kind of crazy throat, so just take a second to review that,
Okay.
and then after you're done, let me know if that refreshes your memory about what time you received that call.
It was approximately 1740 hours,
Which is what time in civilian?
5:40 p.m.
Okay. So after you received the call, did you proceed straight to the location?
Yes, ma'am.
And where was this location?
So the best directions that we had was near Cabazon Peak Road, and I believe there was some GPS coordinates provided. And there's a road called Cerro Los Pinos, and that area is kind of, I mean, it's not very well marked, but in that general vicinity.
Okay. And when you went out to the location, did you meet up with someone?
Yes.
Do you recall who that was?
I believe his name was David McCullough.
Okay, and when you met up with David McCullough, did he assist you in locating the residence where the shooting had occurred?
Yes.
Okay. And how did that happen? Did you go together? Did you follow him there? Did he ride with you?
To my knowledge, there was myself, Deputy Honey Estiwa, and Sergeant Crespin. And I believe Mr. McCullough rode in Deputy Crespin's patrol unit towards the rear. And I was at the lead of the convoy, I guess you could say, and utilizing the radio, he provided directions to Sergeant Crespin, who relayed them to me.
Okay, so approximately how long or how far was it from the point where you met up with Mr. McCullough and when you got to the actual location of the shooting?
Approximately 4 miles, I believe.
Okay. And when you, as you were driving up to the location, what did you observe?
I believe the road split off to, it continued south, and then it branched off to the west, so it would have been like a right-hand turn. I was informed that we were near the location, near the residence, but our view was kind of obstructed due to the terrain. So we kind of like set up there to kind of make sure we had all our resources in place before approaching the residence.
Okay. So how long did you wait there before you made sure you had all the resources you needed?
Maybe a couple minutes.
Okay. So if I understand you right, then did some other deputies arrive at your location to assist?
To my knowledge, people were having difficulty finding us. There's no cell phone reception in that area.
Okay.
So I know my phone wasn't working, and we were kind of in a depression, so our radio communication, like, we'd have to send somebody to the top of the hill. So I think we kind of came to the decision, like, hey, just based off the fact that there's a potential shooting victim, we need to approach the scene as hastily as possible while still maintaining safety. So I think waiting for more people was kind of out of the option because we were given an ETA of hours for state police to show up.
Okay, now at that point, did you know the condition of any victim, whether that a person was alive or not alive?
So at the time, like I said, it was a possible shooting. We had no direct witness to said event, to my knowledge, from what Mr. McCullough had seen. And so, I mean, in law enforcement, we get calls like hoax calls all the time. So at the time, we were using best practices and trying to make sound judgment decisions.
Okay. So at some point, you drove up closer to the ranch?
No, I believe we stayed where the Y intersection was at.
Okay. And what did you observe when you got there?
So around this time, it was dark, and I remember seeing some lights that were headed towards our direction, which in this area, it's very, hardly any people live out there. It's very sparsely populated. So I saw the lights coming towards our location. I believed it was coming from the residents.
Okay, could you actually, was it dark yet when you got out there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so other than the lights of the vehicle approaching, did you see any other lights besides those of the officers?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so when you saw the lights of the vehicle approaching, what did you do?
We have it's called a PA, a public announcement system. I began giving verbal commands over the PA to try to establish contact with the person from a distance.
Okay, and what did you say? More or less, not verbatim, but what
mean-
kind of commands were you giving?
Just basic commands of stop your vehicle, turn it off, get out, kind of stuff like that.
Okay, and did the vehicle stop immediately?
Yes,
Okay, and how many people exited that vehicle?
just one.
Okay, and is the individual that you saw, do you see him in the courtroom here somewhere?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you point him out and describe an article of clothing that he's wearing?
He has on a blue mask, and from my view, it looks like a black or dark navy jacket sitting in between the two women.
Okay, could the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant?
It will so reflect.
So, Mr. Walker, after the defendant exited the vehicle, what did you do next?
I continued to give him commands to approach us, because like I said, we were kind of at a position of advantage. So I had him come to us, and I gave him verbal commands, essentially, and law enforcement, for safety purposes, will have somebody lay them on the ground and have them put their arms out to safely restrain them.
And did he comply?
Yes.
Did you do any sort of search of Mr. Cummings, the defendant?
Just a basic pat down for weapons.
And did you find any weapons on him?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so after that was completed, what did you do then?
I secured him in my patrol unit.
Okay, and when he was secured in the back of your patrol unit, what did you do after that?
Mr. Cummings was asking a lot of questions like, hey, why are you doing this to me? And I was trying to explain to him, this is protocol given the severity of the type of call. And he basically told us that he had acted in self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
And he was harmed by some sort of neurological agent.
That's what he told you?
Yes.
Okay. And when he told you he had been harmed, what did you do?
I asked him if he needed medical assistance.
And did he respond?
No.
Excuse me. To your knowledge, were medical personnel dispatched to the location to examine the defendant?
Yes, ma'am.
And who was that?
I believe it was the Navajo Nation's Medical Service.
And they did that while you were present?
It might have been in the company of another deputy,
Okay.
but I was kind of in the area.
Okay. So what was your next step after that?
So my next step was, okay, is there potentially somebody who's injured that we need to render medical aid to? So our next priority became potentially locating a injured person.
Mm-hmm.
So we, in law enforcement, it's called a security sweep. Basically, we went to go secure the scene and check for any victims.
And when you say the scene, was there help the jury understand what was there some sort of residence there on that property?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a big ranch-style property, I guess. Like there's a fence, and to my knowledge, I want to say there's like some like sheds, like some overhanging structures where somebody might keep horses. There was a RV camper, and there was a small little house in the middle.
Okay. So who besides yourself went in to do the protective sweep inside that residence?
Myself and Deputy Honey Estiba.
Okay. And describe what you observed when you entered the residence.
So whenever I entered the residence, I remember we were standing outside the door, so we had opposite views. And I saw a bathroom and a kitchen area, and I went into the bathroom and kitchen area, and Deputy Honey Estiba went to the other side where he informed me that he had saw a male on the ground.
Did you ever go in there to observe the male that was on the ground?
No.
So after you finished your protective sweep, what did you do after that?
So we exited the residence, we secured it, and we continued clearing the rest of the property. And then after we determined that there was no outstanding suspects or any potential threats, we went back to our patrol units and waited for additional deputies to respond.
So did you have any part in, I don't know, securing the scene is right, but setting up the perimeter and controlling entry and exit?
No, so it's, like I said, it's a very rural area. I believe there's just the one roadway to the property. So where we were set up at, we were able to maintain the security pretty well.
Okay. Now, did you on that day have any sort of lapel recorder on that you were activated, or excuse me, that you were wearing that was activated?
Like a body camera?
Yes.
No body camera.
Did you have any sort of audio recorder?
Yes, a pocket recorder.
Okay. And did you turn that on at any point during your?
Yes.
Okay. When did you turn it on?
Probably right before I was going on scene.
Okay. And what happened to that audio recording after your part in this investigation was complete?
I uploaded it to the Sandoval County's server as part of our evidence procedure.
Okay. And have you had an opportunity since that day to review a portion of that audio recording?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I don't know what number would you do? 13. Okay. May I approach the witness?
You may.
Mr. Walker, I want to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 13. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And there appears to be a name on there. Is that, do you recognize that name?
Yes, that is my signature.
Did you put that on there?
Yes,
And when did you put that on there?
today.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask to play, it's about a 5-minute segment.
You may.
I don't do technology. We might need your IT person if it doesn't work.
Okay.
Judge.
I'm gonna go find it.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, I think this has been stipulated to, correct?
Yeah, we're not objecting.
13 will be admitted.
Thank you.
Hopefully,
Fingers crossed.
we get audio. I'm gonna plug this part in too.
Mr. Walker, if you could listen to it, because I might have a couple of questions about it afterwards.
Okay.
Face away from us, please. Face away. All right, lift up the back of your shirt. All right, spin around for us. Continue to lift your shirt up. Okay, all right. All right, now face away from us. Drop down to your knees. All right, lay face down on the ground, okay? We understand that we have to follow our procedures, okay? All right, now lift your arms up like an airplane. All right, remain in that position. Is there anybody else in the truck with you?
Put your other hand behind
Sir, I'm not.
We understand that, sir. We have to follow our policies and procedures, okay?
Devastated is.
Right.
You just have to do this. It's procedure, sir.
Okay. Right there from the legislature.
Yeah. Do you have anything else on this person? Any pocket knives, anything like that?
No, nothing. Maybe some pocket change.
Okay. I'm gonna roll you. And you said nobody else is out here with you?
There's a gentleman that came down. My dad's just up the road.
Okay. Where's your dad at?
Just up the road about a mile. He called me from Amazon, so he's right about there.
Okay. What
No
kind of
one's on.
vehicle
No
is
one's
he
out there on the premises.
in? Okay. What kind of vehicle is he in? Your dad?
He's in a Toyota Rav.
Okay. What color?
Blue.
Okay.
I'm transitioning. Lay face down.
Who you guys with?
Sandoval County Sheriff's Office.
Okay.
So where is the firearm at?
I put it on the porch.
The porch of the resident?
Yeah, so you guys could get it right
Okay.
there.
And where is the subject at?
He's inside the house.
Inside the house?
Yep.
Okay.
And there is some, whatever he jammed in my face, it admitted some sort of, I don't know what it was, chlorophyll or something.
Okay. Do you need
So
an ambulance?
the house,
Do you need an ambulance?
I was putting the air out of the house, and I went and washed my face off.
All right. We're gonna set you up. All right. Touch your knees under your legs. Knees under your feet. All right. We're gonna lift you up. Okay. All right. We're gonna get your stuff. We're gonna take care of stuff. So which road is your dad coming down? This one? This one? Okay. All right. So they said that his dad is.
Yeah, we're gonna get there.
Sir, we have to do our investigation, okay? We got to do everything by the books, all right? So if you are legitimately defending yourself, okay, we have to preserve the scene, we have to preserve the evidence, we have to do everything by the book, so we'll show that, right? Right, so, I mean, everybody gets the same investigation. I understand this is, you know, yeah. Yeah, so I was gonna say.
Can I give you a layout, guys? You know what you're looking at?
Sure.
So, my truck's in the way, so
Right.
you'll have to probably drive it out here to turn it around. And then you go in, and it's the bar trailer.
Okay,
And you'll
bar
see-
trailer. So
you'll
what
see
what
my-
color is the trailer?
You'll see my rifle on the porch.
Okay, what
You'll
kind
see that
of?
from a good distance.
Okay.
I put the clip, I put the rifle there.
So what color is your trailer?
The trailer, I was communicating with the guy to buy it, but he, it's like a light blue.
Okay, light blue trailer.
There's an
So
RV.
is there
There's an
anybody
RV.
else on any of the other properties?
No,
Okay.
So there's an RV in the first unit,
Okay.
and then you go in and there's another.
Yeah. Hang on one second. Hang on one second. Dude,
What's the address here? Do you know?
You know, I don't know. It doesn't have one, I don't think. It doesn't get delivery or anything.
Oh, really? So you don't have like an actual address here?
No, I'm very new to the property, so I don't know if there is one.
Okay.
It's, the guy's name is Guillaume.
Okay.
You got a placita?
Okay. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Did you see the device in his hand?
I didn't clear that room. The other deputy did, but
Can't discuss anything from the
So-
We're just here to secure, make sure everything's all right. So.
Okay. Mr. Walker, it sounded like he was asking you a question about whether you saw something. Did you hear that?
yes,
What was he asking you?
he asked if I saw a device in his hand, I believe.
In the decedent's hand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and you said you hadn't gone back there, right?
No.
Okay. Let me ask you this. When you observed Mr. Cummings, the defendant, did you observe any kind of injuries on him?
No.
Any scratches or bruises or anything like that?
No.
What about his eyes? I mean, have you been trained as a DRE? Have you received drug recognition training?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did his eyes appear to be red or watery, anything like that?
No.
And when you went out there, you did not know who the defendant was, correct?
Correct.
How did you attempt to find out what his identity was?
So my main role in this response is as a patrol deputy to go out there and secure the scene. Like I said, I didn't go see where the decedent was at because, I don't want to contaminate the scene and potentially ruin the investigation. So my main concern was detaining any possible suspects and securing the scene. So, no,
You
ma'am.
said that you put the defendant in the back of your patrol car.
Yes, ma'am.
Would it be standard practice at that point to try to find out the suspect's identity?
Yes,
Did you try to do that?
I believe so, yes.
And what was his response?
To my knowledge, he did not want to identify himself to us.
I will pass the witness, Your Honor. I'm going to leave this in case you need it, but just because I don't want to break anything. I won't be able to play your audio. I don't want to break it, that's all.
But I will need more room.
Oh, I'll get it.
So-
Do you need it or no?
She doesn't need
I
it.
don't think I need
Okay,
that.
well, I'll just
The one that you just,
grab it.
That way you have yours. Top.
Good afternoon, Mr. Walker. How are you?
Doing good, ma'am. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Let me back up for a minute, okay?
I'm sorry?
I'm going to back up and ask you some preliminary questions.
Okay.
What year did you begin your law enforcement career?
2014?
And in 2014, did I hear you say you worked for the Lee County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, ma'am.
How long did you work there?
2.5 years.
And where'd you go after that?
Hobbs Police Department?
So did you start there in 2016?
In Hobbs, yes, ma'am.
How long did you work for Hobbs?
Believe it was around 2 years.
And then you left Hobbs?
Yes.
Where'd you go when you left Hobbs?
The Sandoval County Sheriff's Office?
How long did you work there?
Approximately 2 years, maybe a little less than.
So what year would you have started in Sandoval County?
To my knowledge, it was November 2018, I believe.
And then did you leave 2020?
Yes.
So that would be the year of this investigation?
Yes.
And where'd you go then?
Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department?
And how long were you there?
2 years?
And now you're no longer in law enforcement, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, on February 29th of 2020, that's when you get dispatched, is that right?
Yes.
And you understand at the time that you're getting dispatched, that you are being dispatched to a possible homicide,
Yes.
and you ran an audio recording device, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, it's my understanding that you actually had some type of a camera, but for some reason you didn't use it. Is that correct?
Yes.
So why didn't you use the camera?
Because it did not work.
The camera didn't work.
Yes, ma'am.
How long had the camera not worked?
For several months.
And had you gone to any of your supervisors and told them that your camera didn't work?
Multiple times.
And did they ever replace your camera?
I was told there was not money to replace the cameras.
So you run your audio recording device because that is all you have at your disposal, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And the small portion of the recording that we heard today, I think, is about 5 minutes. But have you had an opportunity to listen to the entire audio recording that you recorded?
No.
Okay, hang on just a second. So, Mr. Walker, do you have any idea how long the entire audio recording is that you recorded on that night?
To my recollection, it's probably an hour and a half long.
An hour and a half. Now, I have listened to the entire hour and a half, and I've never heard you ask him his name. Am I wrong? Would you like to have an opportunity to review it?
I'm not saying that you're wrong.
So, Ms. Romo asked you if you asked him his name and if he refused to give it to you, and you indicated that that occurred. So if that occurred, we heard your recording. We can clearly hear your voice, right?
Yes.
Now, it's harder to hear Mr. Cummings' voice on your recording, right?
When I'm not walking and moving, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to give you an opportunity right now. You can agree with me that you never asked him his name, or we can take a break for an hour and a half, and you can review your entire audio recording and come out and give us your final answer. What would you like to do?
So I guess I didn't ask him his name.
So are you testifying today from your memory, or are you testifying based on a conversation that you had with someone at the district attorney's office? Where is your testimony coming from?
From my memory.
But you didn't take the time to actually sit and review your audio recording, right?
So I have listened to it. As far as in entirety recently, no, ma'am.
Since the date of incident on February 29th, 2020, have you listened to the entire recording?
Yes.
When was that?
After the incident, when I was typing my report.
So what day would that have been?
The day of or the next day?
So have you listened to the audio recording that you made anytime within the last 2.5 years?
No.
Now, by the time you show up there to the area, the first person you make contact with is Mr. McCullough, right?
Yes.
And how much time do you spend with Mr. McCullough? Do you recall?
Not a very long time.
What does that mean to you? Was it minutes? Was it 10 minutes? An hour?
Minutes approximately.
Okay. And after speaking to Mr. McCullough, you went kind of with Mr. McCullough to this area where the ranch was, is that right?
Yes.
So how long do you think it took you before you made contact with Mr. Cummings?
It's a rough road, so I would probably guess maybe 30 minutes to an hour.
30 minutes to an hour from what time?
May I refresh my memory?
Sure, would something refresh your memory?
My police report.
May I?
You may.
Did that refresh your memory?
Yes.
So walk us through this timeline a little bit.
So approximately 25 minutes.
From when?
From making contact with Mr. McCullough to making contact with Mr. Cummings.
Okay. So 25 minutes from the time that you made contact with McCullough to the time that you make contact with Cummings.
Yes.
And when did you receive the dispatch call to head out to Cabazon Peak?
I believe it was at 5:40 p.m.
How long did it take you to get out there and make your contact with Mr. McCullough?
Approximately 26, or I apologize. I don't want to give a specific time, but I know that I was coming from Cuba and I was driving with my emergency lights and sirens activated. So drive time from Cuba to that location. If you'd let me refresh my memory, I could give you more specific time frame.
What would refresh your memory?
My police report. So approximately 46 minutes.
So it takes you 46 minutes to get to the location to make contact with McCullough.
Yes.
And then it takes you another 25 minutes before you're able to make contact with Mr. Cummings.
Yes.
Okay. And you don't know what time the shooting occurred, correct?
No, ma'am.
All right. Now, before you arrive out there, you already have some information about what's going on, right? Let me ask you this. Isn't it true that you're receiving updated information on your CAD system?
Yes.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what a CAD is?
Actually, I'd like to, from my memory, I don't believe that we had an up-to-date CAD system at Sandoval County Sheriff's Office at the time of this incident.
What do you mean?
So some agencies have computer-assisted dispatch, and I do not believe Sandoval County had a computer-assisted dispatch at the time.
So let me ask you this. Who is communicating to you when you're out in your car telling you where to go and what to do?
Dispatch.
And so how are you receiving that information?
A radio?
And are you receiving it on a computer also?
To my knowledge, I was not.
But you're receiving it over the radio.
Yes.
And what you're receiving over the radio is there is a written record of it, whether you received it at that moment on your computer or not, a written record of it is made, correct?
That would be through the dispatch system, to my knowledge.
Right. But look, isn't it true that at 5:50 p.m., you receive information from dispatch that says Dean Cummings, phone number 907-831-6512, claiming he was attacked, tried to defend himself, and shot the individual dead? You received that information, did you not?
If dispatch relayed it over the radio, yes.
Yes. So before you ever arrived, you knew his name. They had already given you his name, and they had already told you what was going on. You had that information, correct?
So when I received the call, I began responding to the area with my emergency lights and sirens activated. I am traveling as fast as my patrol unit will go, which is approximately 105 miles per hour. I do not have time to remember every detail. There's cars that I'm avoiding. I have to obey traffic laws. I am not taking the time to take notes on all information. I'm trying to get to the scene as fast as I can.
Of course, I have no expectation that you would take notes. My point is, there's a reason that I don't hear you ask on the audio recording what his name was. You already had it. Mr. McCullough already had it, right?
So we did not have a computer-assisted dispatch, and also the phone was not working. So I don't see how I'm going to, when I get to the scene, I see what you're saying, but if there's no internet signal, I'm not going to be able to receive this information in real time, and I'm also not going to be able to call dispatch and ask them questions.
Dispatch, oh, all right, let's back up. At 5:50, you are still able to hear the radio communications as you're driving in your car, right?
When you're driving 105 miles per hour in a Dodge Ram with air resistance over the light bars and sirens, it is very difficult to hear every radio transmission. If I heard it, I do not recall.
All right. Are you disputing that the dispatcher said Dean Cummings, with his phone number, claiming he was attacked, tried to defend himself, and shot the individual dead? Are you denying that that came out over your radio?
I'm not denying that. I'm saying perhaps I did not hear it.
But you agree with me, just so we're clear, that nowhere on that audio recording did you ask him his name?
Correct.
Was there some point in time when you separated yourself from your recording device?
Yes.
When was that?
So whenever we secured Mr. Cummings in the back seat of my patrol unit, I don't have a recording device in my patrol unit that works. I made the decision to leave my pocket recorder inside my patrol unit while I went to the property. Now, whether I was vigilant in putting that on my person at all times, I cannot recall. Like I said, there was a lot of moving pieces, but I figured for the integrity of the case, it was better that I left my pocket recorder where Mr. Cummings was at while I performed the security sweep.
So let me understand this. You leave your pocket recorder where Mr. Cummings is?
On my passenger seat of my patrol unit, yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Cummings was in your unit?
In the back seat, yes, ma'am.
Who was staying with Mr. Cummings when you were not in your unit?
Deputy Crispine.
So,
Sergeant Crispine.
So your audio recorder was recording even though you weren't there?
Yes.
So you separated yourself from the recording device, but you didn't separate the recording device from Mr. Cummings?
That is correct.
Okay. So there wasn't any point in time where he was saying things that aren't recorded?
So if you look at the time frame of the call, my pocket recorder actually dies, so that is why it's at an hour and a half duration and not for the entirety of the incident.
Right, but that doesn't happen for an hour and a half.
So whenever we cleared the property, like I said, it's a very large property. I don't know how long it took us to clear it, but it took a long time. I remember I was physically exhausted after searching the premises.
But your recording device ran the entire time that you were clearing the property.
Yes, but was not on me.
It wasn't on you.
So I don't remember exactly when I took it off my person, but I remember that I left it with Mr. Cummings and separated myself from at some point in time.
And on the recording device, on the audio recording, we can hear you go and clear the residence, and we can hear you come back, right? Or do you not know because you haven't reviewed it?
I was waiting on the second PTI from your office to review it.
I don't understand second PTI.
So I had a PTI hearing with your office, I believe. And I was told that there would be a second PTI where you requested that I listen to it second per second, and I never received notification for that.
There was a discussion during your interview about the fact that no one had your recorder, had your recording device. That's true.
Right.
But we're 2.5 years into the case now.
Right. And I also separated from the agency, and I don't have access to that.
Okay. So now, Mr. Cummings was completely cooperative with you, correct?
Yes.
He followed all of your commands, correct?
Yes.
You asked him numerous questions, and he answered all of your questions, even though he didn't have to, correct?
Sometimes he didn't answer directly to the question, but he did speak on some matters.
Like, what are you referring to?
I asked him if he needed an ambulance. He didn't answer that question with an affirmative yes or no.
Well, that's not really what the audio recording bears out. Isn't it true that some of his answers are inaudible because your recording device isn't close enough to him, right?
Correct.
So we could hear on the recording that Ms. Romo played for you, we could hear you ask if he needed an ambulance. You asked him twice. The second time, the first part of what he says we can't hear, and then we can hear him say, I had to wash my face, correct?
That is not a yes or a no, but yes, you are correct.
Okay, so it's not like he was ignoring you. And the inaudible portions of that recording, do you remember what he says?
It was over 2 years ago, no ma'am.
Right. So if there's a portion of the transcript that's inaudible, you don't recall what he said, do you?
No.
So just to be clear, and what I'm flipping through here, in case you need to refresh your memory with it, I'm flipping through a transcript of the audio recording.
Your Honor, if she's going to use that to impeach, I have not received a copy.
Well, I haven't tried to use it to impeach yet, but I'm happy to give her a copy.
I'm just bringing it up. It looks like it's where she was going.
So one of the very first things that Mr. Cummings told you when you had contact with him is he said, I'm not armed, right?
To my knowledge, yes.
You asked him, where's the firearm at, correct?
Yes.
And he gave you a very direct answer. He said, I put it on the porch, right?
Yep.
You said, where is the subject at? And he gave you a very direct answer. He said, he's inside the house, right?
Yes.
You asked him, what color is the trailer? And he tries to answer you. Part of it's inaudible, but you're able to clear it up. You say, what color is your trailer? He says it's light blue, right?
If that's what's on the pocket recorder, yes,
If you
ma'am.
need to refresh your memory, I'm happy to show you this.
Can we get a page reference, please?
Sure, right now I'm on page 14. You ask him, is there anybody else on any of the other properties? He says no, correct?
That is correct.
You asked him, is your residence unlocked, sir? He said yes. You asked, do you have any dogs or anything? He said no dogs, right?
Yes.
Now, if you recall, you had a conversation with Mr. Cummings that is on your recording about the clothes that he took off. Do you recall that?
Yes.
He told you that he took his clothes off because he had been sprayed with whatever this man had in his hand, correct?
Yes.
And he told you exactly where the clothes were, right?
Yes.
Where were they?
To my recollection, they were on the back of his pickup truck.
And in addition to telling you where the clothes were, didn't he also ask you to be sure to preserve them, to put them in a trash bag, he said?
Right.
Okay. So in no way did he try to hide the clothes from you, prevent you from obtaining them. In fact, he did the opposite, right?
That is correct.
You asked him what the address was. He told you that there wasn't one out there.
I believe
Right.
that was Deputy Honey Estiwa who asked him what the address was.
Okay. And we're just hearing it on your recording.
Yes.
And you make an important point. You're not the only person speaking to Mr. Cummings, right? There's other deputies who are speaking to him at the same time. You're just the only one with a recording device on, correct?
To my knowledge, yes, ma'am.
All right. You even asked him if he had a key to his fifth wheel so that you could get in it without too much trouble, and he directed you to where the key was, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Give me just one moment. One of the things, just to be clear, that we heard on the audio recording is initially when you make contact with Mr. Cummings, he says to you, "I'm devastated." Isn't that what he said?
To me, that part sounded inaudible, but that could have been what he said.
Would it refresh your memory if you looked at the transcript, or do you want to agree with me?
I mean, your level of hearing is different from mine, so I'm not sure your transcript is accurate with what I would be hearing from my pocket recorder.
All right, well, let's go ahead and let me see if I can, would it refresh your memory if you listen to it again?
Sure.
Okay.
I would ask if that's the case, we play the whole thing so it's not out of context.
I'm not intending to play an hour and a half.
Well, Your Honor, she brought it up, so.
I'm not intending to be here for an hour and a half.
Right, so
Neither is the jury, I don't think. He can listen to it overnight
Yep.
and bring it back.
what? Well, we can do it a couple of different, it's part of the short clip that we played for the jury. So we can play that 5-minute clip again because it's in there. Or we can have the gentleman listen to the hour and a half overnight and he can come back tomorrow, whatever everyone prefers. It seems easier that he just listened to the 5-minute clip.
Ms. Romo.
I'm not sure where she's going with it. I mean, if she's going to refer to different parts of this entire interview, which she's been doing, then I think we need to play the whole thing for the jury. She's been referring to this entire alleged transcript of his belt tape, which is way longer than 5 minutes. And most of it is just him driving. But if she's going to ask specific things that are outside that 5-minute clip, then we need to hear the whole thing.
I'm not limited to the 5-minute clip that Ms. Romo chose.
Okay, Counsel, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to recess for the day, provide him with the 1.5-hour recording, and we'll come back in the morning.
Sure. I don't have a disc of it. Yeah. I have the recording on my computer.
We can have one made.
Sure, he can come to my office and pick it up. It's in Albuquerque.
Okay, let's do this for, Ms., go ahead and have a seat. Let me just read the recess instruction for, it's just been a long day for the jury, so let me read the recess instruction, and we'll break until tomorrow. And folks, pay attention to this instruction. I'll read it one time, and as the trial goes on, I'll just remind you of the instruction instead of reading it. It's rather redundant. During recess, do not discuss this case with other jurors or with any other person, or allow anyone else to discuss the case with you or in your presence. You as jurors must decide this case based solely on the evidence presented here within the 4 walls of this courtroom. This means that during the trial, you must not conduct any independent research about the case, the matters in this case, and the individuals or corporations involved in this case. In other words, you should not consult dictionaries or reference materials, search the internet, websites, blogs, or use any other electronic tool to obtain information about this case or to help you decide the case. Do not try to find out information from any source outside the confines of this courtroom. Until you retire to deliberate, you may not discuss the case with anyone, even your fellow jurors. After you retire to deliberate, you may begin discussing the case with your fellow jurors, but you cannot discuss the case with anyone else until you have returned a verdict and the case is at an end. I know that many of you use cell phones, the internet, and other tools of technology. You also must not talk to anyone about this case or use these tools to communicate electronically with anyone about the case. This includes your family and friends. You may not communicate with anyone about the case on your cell phone or through any other device that can access the internet, through email, text messaging, or on Twitter, through any blog or website, through any internet chat room, or by way of any other social networking website such as Facebook. During your deliberations, you must not communicate with or provide any information to anyone by any means about this case. You may not use any electronic device or media such as a telephone, cell phone, or any other device that can access the internet, any internet service, or any text or instant messaging service, or any internet chat room, or by way of any other social networking website such as Facebook, to communicate to anyone any information about this case or to conduct any research about this case until I accept your verdict. Avoid any publicity this case may receive. Do not read, listen to, or watch any news accounts of this trial. Do not express any opinion about the case or form any fixed opinion until the case is finally submitted you for your decision. Okay, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to recess for the day. Be here around 9:20. We'll start around right around 9:30 in the morning. Come directly into, actually, wait for us in the hallway. Once all 14 of you are here, Loretta will bring you back. You'll always remain in your same chair. Leave your jury bag on your chairs, all right? And your badges, also leave your badges on your chair or in front of you, and you can put them back on tomorrow. And we'll be in recess until tomorrow. And I know one of the jurors wanted to bring coffee in. I will talk to the security before the end of the day, make sure that they allow you to bring it in. All right. So we'll be in recess until tomorrow morning. And just, follow Ms. Martinez this way. Mr. Walker, please sit down. You're just consult with the DA before you leave, so you can get the disc of how that's going to work. You may be seated, and Deputy, have Mr. Cummings here about 8:45. You have him here, well, even if you have him in the whole time, we'll bring him in here before the jury comes in. Yes. All right.
We're starting at 9:30?
9:30.
Okay.
I want him about 45 minutes early.
Sure, of course.
And then, and don't dress him out, but bring him here. I want him at the council table before we bring him to jury. Here by 8:45, yes. All right, okay, we'll be in recess until tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
May I be dismissed?
Yes, we're good. Yeah.
I would give him one, but I only have it on my computer. Yeah, I don't have one as, we'll have to make a CD or.
We'll probably send it to you on the OneDrive. Do you know how to get access on the OneDrive?
So I don't have, like,
That's what I said. Yeah. Oh, why we couldn't have just had him listen to the 5 minutes, I don't know. But